Hello and welcome to programme 14 of Art in Isolation, in which I'm going to take you into the house to look at art that you can eat. This room here is a kitchen attached to the barn. It's a sort of catering kitchen, really. We use it for events, but the paintings on the wall are just as important to me as anywhere else. Now you could say, oh well, I'm not surprised, he's visually neurotic. Well, I probably am, but I think the right painting in a kitchen can have great benefits. It can inspire you to deeds of greatness. And one painting which I think is difficult to improve upon in terms of kitchen art is this one over here. And it's painted in Paris in 1953 by an artist called David Hill. We found this picture in a sale together with 3 or 4 others by the artist around about 10 years ago. And I loved it for 2 reasons. I mean, the first is the ingredients in the picture. They're all delicious. I'm 9/10 vegetarian, and that suited me. But also it's a reminder of that other thing as well as art that Paris and France produced from the late 19th century onwards and influenced the world. And that's its cuisine. And you could say that with food, with haute cuisine, it was the equivalent of Impressionism. It greatly increased the possibilities of feeling when it came to tasting food and cooking it. You know, the sauces and the subtleties meant that food became something to really rejoice in. And when this was painted in the 1950s, Elizabeth David was getting going, that great ambassador, bringing all of these wonderful ideas from Europe over to England and latterly to America. David Hill is an intriguing, rather shadowy figure. He was born in 1914 in New York. He moved to Ohio and he came back to New York before embarking for Paris, where he ended up in 1947, shortly after it had been occupied by the Germans. He met his lifelong partner, a chap called Joe Plaskett, and he'd set up a house in the Mary. Apparently it was exquisite and full of wonderful objects from flea markets. He then went on to produce art, but what is so interesting is that clearly, and this painting expresses it, he embraced the wonderful export of France, Paris at the period, which was really beginning to catch on across the world again, and that was the soufflé. I say again because it had been around. In fact, the soufflé was invented in the early 18th century, but it was beginning to live again. Its fortunes were beginning to rise. And what are we looking at this picture? Well, I see it almost like a poem of 3 stanzas. At the top, you've got the finding of the ingredients. You have here on the left the cookery book. Then you have just beneath not only the eggs, but also the chestnuts. This is obviously going to be, gosh, sounds delicious, a chestnut soufflé. And there you have some sugar and butter. The scene below, looking at it from left to right, is the action. The eggs have been cracked. All the bowls around it are there to receive or have recently received the ingredients. And then finally, in the foreground, rising beautifully, I wish I could do that with my soufflés, is the finished result. What a satisfying painting. Now, if you look at it and examine the way that it's painted, it is superbly illustrative. In fact, it could almost be the visual equivalent of a recipe and how to cook a soufflé. And I think that's part of the charm and the idiosyncrasy of this picture. It is painted by someone who wants to communicate the information and is held back with their own emotional content. In the obituary of his partner, Joe Plaskett, it mentions the work of David Hill as a trompe-l'oeil painter. In fact, Cary Grant apparently bought his works. And I think that is the way to understand the art. What we're looking at is someone who wants to communicate with a sort of almost photographic exactitude objects that you could almost hold and touch. That is what trompe-l'oeil is. It goes back many centuries, and it's the idea of taking the viewer in, almost believing that this is real life that's happening in front of you. What it does mean, of course, is you might not have as much emotion, as much of yourself as the artist, but it's superbly clinical and clean, and I think rather nice to have in a kitchen. And there's one final painting, the other side of the room, that I want to mention, which is also by David Hill, and this is a bunch of eggs. Similarly, it's about ingredients, and I like the objectivity, the clarity with which he's just stated what they are on the plate. I also love the hues, the subtleties of the different eggshells, and the spherical shapes. I do like eggs. In fact, one of the things that I regret most in terms of pictures that have passed, or nearly passed through my hands, was a drawing by David Hockney, done in the 1960s, of two eggs on a plate. And they absolutely hummed eggness. He managed to capture the inner egg with his crayons in both of them. It was about £12,000 at the time, and I felt I just couldn't reach that high, and I let them go. I still regret it. It still cracks into my dreams every now and then, that thought of owning that picture. Anyway, let's put that aside. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for all of your continuing and lovely comments. And I have to say, we do read them all. Please forgive us if we don't get back to everyone, but we really appreciate it. And it's wonderful that sometimes some of these pictures, some of these funny items in the house do reach you and have an impact. Tomorrow I'm also going to talk about still life, a slightly different one. I'm going to hold it up to you now, and it'll be quite interesting. I'll count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It'll be quite interesting to know whether or not you can guess roughly what date it is. It's not altogether that obvious. Thank you. Lovely to see you. Back tomorrow.